The switchMap operator maps each value to an observable and then flattens that observable. Unlike mergeMap, switchMap only maintains one active inner subscription at a time, so anytime we map to a new inner observable, the previous is completed. On the first emitted value from the source, the behavior for switchMap will be identical to mergeMap. A new inner subscription is created, and each value emitted by the inner observable is emitted by switchMap. What makes switchMap unique is apparent on the next emitted value from the source observable. At this point, the previously active inner observable will be completed, and the next returned observable will be switched to. This happens on any emissions from the source observable. Contrast this with mergeMap, which will maintain and emit values from any number of active inner observables at a time. Let's examine switchMap more in code. To understand how switchMap differs from mergeMap, let's start with the first example from the previous lesson. In this example, we have a stream of click events that we are mapping to an inner interval on each click. So when we click, we see a new interval created. And with mergeMap, when we click again, we see a second interval start running, and so on. Now let's swap out mergeMap with switchMap to see how the behavior differs. Within the pipe method, we'll just update this to use switchMap. Now when we click on the document, we'll see the interval start running, similar to mergeMap. But when we click a second time, instead of a second inner subscription being created, like mergeMap, we see the numbers restart. This happens on each emission from the source observable. A new interval is mapped to, then subscribed, and the previously active subscription is completed. Now that we understand the basic behavior for switchMap, let's take a look at one of its most common use cases by revisiting an example from the debounce time lesson. In this example, we had a stream of keyup events from the input box. We were first debouncing the stream to only emit the latest value after a 200 millisecond pause. We then used pluck to grab the value of the input box and applied the distinct until changed operator to ensure that only unique values were emitted based on the previous value. So when I type, after a 200 millisecond pause, we can see the current value logged to the console. If I type and backspace quickly, distinct until change will prevent the duplicate value from being emitted. What we have in this operator chain is the basis for any advanced type ahead using RxJS. Let's see how the addition of switchMap can help us finish off this functionality. So what we want to do is map any search term we receive to an AJAX observable and flatten that using switchMap, emitting the response. Before we do this, let's talk about why we actually want to use switchMap here versus just using mergeMap. In the previous lesson, we used mergeMap to simulate saves by logging button clicks on a page. mergeMap works great in scenarios like this as you do not want your save request canceled, and you also don't really care about ordering of the responses, just that the save completed or failed. However, in this example, as the user types, if another request comes through, we no longer care about the response of any request that is still hanging. In fact, it could actually cause us issues if responses were to come in out of order, which is completely possible with mergeMap. SwitchMap, on the other hand, will cancel the previous inner observable, including the request, if an updated value is emitted. To see this in action, let's go ahead and add the SwitchMap import now. Next, let's also import the AJAX creation operator. In this example, we'll be using the getJSON method to make a request to the typeahead API. Let's also go ahead and create a constant for this API URL now. This is just a free public API we can use to return names of breweries that match a provided search term. Now that we have all these pieces in place, let's come down and uncomment this switchMap code. And let's reformat this slightly so it's a little more clear. And we need to add a return statement to return our AJAX observable. The getJSON method accepts a URL to make a GET request to, so we need to adjust this now. So we'll just use a template literal to dynamically build this URL. So the first item will be the base URL, and the query parameter is by name. And each time we make a request, we're going to pass the search term to the query parameter. Now let's save and we'll see how this works. So let's go ahead and switch to the Network tab in DevTools. And now whenever I type and pause, we can see a new request is initiated. If we take a closer look at the response in the console, we can see an array of items being returned whose name matches the search term we provided. To see SwitchMap's cancellation effect more clearly, let's actually comment out the debounce time operator for a second. And we'll save and let's reopen the Network tab. Now when I type, you can see the stale request being canceled as SwitchMap switches to a new observable on each new value. So at this point we have all the major functionality of our typeahead complete. To display these results within your UI, you could simply update the subscribe method to display these options as a list, an overlay, or whatever pattern fits your interface the best. For the sake of this example, let's keep it simple and just dump these names into a container element so we can see everything working together. So let's head to our HTML file and create a div to hold the names of our type ahead. And we'll just give it an ID of type ahead container. Next, let's go back to our JavaScript file and we'll create a constant for this container. And we'll just call it typeahead container. And we'll use document.getElementById to grab a reference. So we'll just paste in this ID. Next, let's head back to our subscribe method to update our UI anytime a response is submitted. So what we're going to do is take our typeahead container and update the inner HTML. So we'll take the response and we just need the names. So let's map this array to just the brewery names by giving it a function that just returns the name property. And finally, to keep it simple, we'll just join this array with break tags to create our HTML string. Let's save now so we can see the final result. So let's go ahead and close this console so we have a little more room. And now when we start typing, we can see the matching names displayed in our UI. And if we change our input, we can see that it's updated. To recap, the switchMap operator maps and switches to a new observable on each value, canceling any previously active inner subscriptions. Because of switchMap's canceling behavior, I consider it the safest default for flattening operators, as it's much harder to create leaks on accident with long-running inner observables like you can using mergemap. Some primary use cases for switchMap include HTTP requests that can be canceled, such as GET request, and implementing any functionality surrounding resetting, pausing, and resuming. You should avoid using switchMap when cancellation can have undesired effects, such as saves.